Good evening, everybody. It's kind of strange not being able to be in a room with you all and see you face to face. That would obviously be my preference, but it's a real honour to have been asked to speak to you this evening. So thank you for attending. The thanks really go to Professor Sir Keith Porter, who asked if I would do this talk, and I had absolutely no hesitation in saying yes. He's an extremely important person in my life, as will become clear, but you've probably got a fair idea looking at a couple of those photos there. I believe there's one or two others in the audience that I know as well, so it's really lovely to have you on board. I was trying to furiously look at the names as they were coming in on the chat, but it'll be lovely afterwards to sort of have a look to see who's been here. So I've called the talk From Afghanistan to Antarctica to sort of really place two key events in my life, pre and post injury. And what I really intend to do is just give you a bit of my story and offer you the patient perspective, which hopefully will help to sort of reassure you how amazing the work is that you all do, and it's just lovely for me to have this opportunity to thank you on behalf of all of us patients for the amazing work you do. But let me get on without any further ado. So I'm going to start by saying, don't worry, there's no life history from age 4 here, but it's pretty hard for me to deny from this photo that I wanted to join the army from an early age. So here I am with my eldest brother. I'm one of the youngest of 3, so 2 older brothers, and always loved running around trying to keep up with them and building dens in the woods and sleeping overnight. And at school, loved my studies, but also really enjoyed sport, and particularly team sports. So I knew from a young age that I wanted to pursue a career that would challenge me physically as well as mentally, and one that was very much about working in a team of people. And that for me meant more than sort of sitting at a desk next to them. And I love the fact that my brother here, who's still serving and is a full colonel now, has got this beaming smile on his face, whereas I've got this sort of good old bayonet grimace of determination. Following university then, I joined the army and spent my first year conducting my officer training at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. You might expect me to sort of touch on the subject of leadership here, because it is recognised as one of the global centres of excellence for leadership. And you do obviously learn certainly the theory of leadership, and you put it into practice a little bit, but you're trying to lead a load of other people who are wanting to be leaders. So it's not really until you go on your first posting that you get to understand leadership for real, as in when you're leading soldiers. But what does stand out for me from this year was really understanding the true meaning of teamwork. So what it means to work together in a group of people with whom you might have some personal differences, but you're working together towards a common goal. And so you support whoever's in that leadership position, that position of responsibility, because you've got that common purpose that unifies you. I commissioned then into the Royal Artillery and spent 12, 13 years undertaking a huge variety of roles. We change jobs every couple of years, which will mean a change of team and almost certainly also a change of location. So you get very used to dealing with that change. The variety that you enjoy, any young officer enjoys, is phenomenal. So for whether that's your location, so I served in the UK and in Germany. I undertook jungle training in Belize. I also had the honour to do some ceremonial duty, firing guns, the guns in royal salutes in honour of things like the Queen's birthday. So a really broad spectrum of tasks and responsibilities. But common to all of those different roles is the absolute privilege that it is to command soldiers. Now, I took over my first command at the age of 25 when I took responsibility for a troop of about 40 soldiers, ranging in age from from about 18 to 38 years old. And you can start to imagine that for a young officer fresh out of training with no practical experience, how daunting that prospect is. Imagine then taking over that command and all that entails on operational duty in Iraq, where your regiment is already posted and you have to fly out there on your own. And you can understand that my apprehension grew even more. But as in so many cases where you're presented with a challenge, there's so often an opportunity that comes with it. And for me, this was a golden opportunity, because when you're deployed in operations, you're living and working with your soldiers 24/7. So you have every opportunity to get to know them. And for me, that was crucial. If I was going to lead my soldiers as best I could, I had to get to know them as best I could. Our motto at Sandhurst is serve to lead. We very much view leadership as a service, as a privilege. And I knew that I had to know my soldiers as best I could in order to properly serve them. So 3 years later, after that first tour of Iraq, I'm out to Iraq a second time. So a little bit of operational experience under my belt now, and crucially actually time to prepare. So this time I had the 6 months pre-deployment training, which covered obviously, your technical role. It covered obviously building relationships with your team, and of course some medical training too, but really kind of at a minimum. We trained for about 5 of those 6 months for this role, and then a month before we deployed, I was told that that role no longer existed, that my boys would be off doing something else, working for somebody else in a different role, and I also would be in a new role in a different team. So that's pretty unsettling, 4 weeks out from deploying, having spent 5 months building these relationships and understanding and training for a certain role, to suddenly have to, as we'd say in the artillery, switch fire and prepare yourself for something new. And one of the things I've found helpful in these sorts of situations is taking control of what you can, so kind of bounding the challenge, if you like, and understanding what's within and what's out with your control. So I identified the things in my control, like what key strengths and skills I had to bring to bear in this new role, how important I knew it was to build these relationships very quickly with the new team, and then also looking at what my weaker areas were and where I might need to ask for help. And so you can kind of settle into that new role quickly by not kind of giving into the panic. Fast forward a year, so coming back from that tour, and I immediately am posted out to Germany, where I immediately start training for a third tour of duty, but this time to Afghanistan. So a much smaller command this time. Here I am with my team of 5. Hopefully it's not that they thought I was rubbish, that my command went from 40 down to 5. But this was a specific role that we were training for as what's called a fire support team, an FST, providing that indirect fire support to an infantry company. So whilst I had significantly more operational experience under my belt by now, and I had time to prepare and train, and the role didn't change this time, the challenge was a different theatre of operations, a much more challenging one, a much more kinetic tour we were expecting, and particularly in the role that we were in, supporting an infantry company, so on the front line in that fast-paced environment of combat operations. So in the months leading up to deployment, as I mentioned for Iraq, obviously we concentrated on our technical training. Very important this time because we were directly supporting another cap badge, an infantry company, that we train as much as we possibly could with them to understand their standard operating procedures, their SOPs, to build the relationships with the company, and to understand how our role and my team fitted in with them, so that once we were out in Afghanistan, it all felt completely normal. There was more of an emphasis on medical training this time. I can remember a memorable exercise where we had the group Amputees in Action come to help us with the training, and provided some really realistic support to really help us feel as best prepared as possible. And there's no point shying away from some of the injuries that can happen out there. The best thing is to be as informed and prepared as possible. We all had very basic medical training. I was very keen that all of my team complete the slightly higher level of team medic training, but I was refused that, unfortunately. So I think we had 2 in the team who had that higher level of training. But I knew from the relationships I built with the infantry company that they had a very strong medical support, and so on that front we were content deploying out to Afghanistan in August 2008. So here's a sort of typical day at the office. We would be out on patrol for a few hours at a time and come back into base, and then sort of prepare to go out again the next day. Or we might be out on a more deliberate operation where we'll be out for several days at a time. This was a bit of a bad day where the car's broken down pretty severely. So the work didn't stop if we weren't out on patrol, we'd be back in base, and there was always, because of these big, heavy armoured tracked vehicles, plenty of maintenance to do. Some of which was done by ourselves, some of which with the previous photo would have been done by the REME, the Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers, but certainly enough to keep us out of trouble. And this is a sort of a rare photograph, really, of me looking unhappy. And this is really because, as you can see, we've got a rare bit of downtime. And actually, we didn't really enjoy downtime because there's nothing that you can do with downtime except, perhaps read a magazine or a letter from home, which is lovely. But you don't really want to get sort of out of the zone of where you are and think too much about the normality back home, because you want to stay focused on the job and just retain that sense of purpose. We'll move on from that rather unattractive photo. So here I am in the command seat of the turret of this Warrior armoured vehicle. You can see I've sort of got the desert dust on my face. That was my makeup out there. I've got my body armour and helmet and pretty heavy headset, which was our radio communication. So I'd be listening to 2 different radio nets, as well as then the internal communications within the vehicle. So halfway through the tour, about 3 months in, I was in exactly this position in the vehicle. We were coming back from an operation. We'd been out for about 3 days. We were returning to base to do a very quick turnaround before going to relieve half of my team who were deployed at that point in another location, and we were going to be swapping around with them. We were only about 1 kilometre away from our base when we were crossing over what's called a Cariz line, so a sort of underground ditch system. And I can remember, travelling very slowly. These vehicles are very difficult to manoeuvre, particularly at a slow speed. And there was a jolt, and I heard an explosion, but I didn't see anything. And I wasn't 100% sure at first whether we'd been hit or whether someone behind us had been hit, which might sound a bit odd, but I was expecting disturbance going over this obstacle anyway. And with that headset on, actually that really sort of dulled the sound of the explosion. But the first thing I did was check my radio, and that wasn't working. So that confirmed for me that it was us that had been hit. And actually what had happened was that we had run over an IED, so an improvised explosive device. Later found out that 50 kilograms of explosive detonated behind me, and the blast wave that came out from it killed one of the soldiers in the back and injured 4 of us. I had no idea to begin with the extent of the aftermath of this incident. Having ascertained that it was us who'd been hit, I checked that H, my lad next to me, was okay. I shouted down to Jacko, my driver, to check that he was okay. I didn't have access to the back of the vehicle, so I asked H next to me to see what the situation was in the back. Obviously, with the radios having gone, then I couldn't speak to them. I had a strong sense very quickly that all was not well in the back, and one look at H's face as well, who was trying to remain very calm and did an excellent job, assured me that it was pretty much carnage in the back of the vehicle. I'd also sort of looked around during this time to see whether there was any live enemy on the ground, because obviously that would change hugely how we dealt with the incident. Thankfully, there was no live enemy on the ground, so we could be a little bit more relaxed in how we dealt with things. And actually in this probably 2 minutes that it took for all of that to happen, I turned around to look behind me, and the sergeant major who is in charge of the medics and in handling an incident like this and in organising the CASEVAC was at the back of my vehicle already, and the medics are out and they were already assessing the situation and going through their triage. Now I think it's something interesting to mention here that women can join the infantry nowadays. Back in 2008, they couldn't. And one of the arguments against it had always been that people were worried that if a female casualty were taken, that she would be prioritised over perhaps her more seriously injured male colleagues. I can absolutely assure you that that was not the case in this situation. Quite rightly, the casualties in the back were prioritised, because it was very quickly assessed that at least 1 or 2 of those were more seriously injured. All I knew at that point was that my leg felt a bit funny, great medical diagnosis, And as I felt down the front of it, I could feel broken bones. So I said, you know, I'm fine. I've broken my leg, but I'm fine. And genuinely was. That wasn't me being tough, but I felt absolutely fine. And because, as I say, there was no live enemy on the ground, I could pull myself up onto the roof of the vehicle, so out of that turret. And my 2 lads from my team could start helping me. Their definition of help was to try to stab me with morphine straight away. I think they just wanted an excuse to jab me with a needle, which actually I didn't need straight away. I wasn't in pain. Whether that was adrenaline or what, I don't know. But after you know, a bit of time, the discomfort actually that I felt was more like an intense pressure building up in my left leg. And I was desperate for them to take my boot off to relieve the pressure. And obviously they were concerned more about keeping the boot on to contain whatever injury I had. So I put up with it for a bit longer and accepted some morphine. And then eventually I insisted that they take the boot off. And I don't know whether that has made any difference to my injury. And there's no point, you know, sort of mulling over that too much. But what I suspect it might have done was alert them to actually the severity of my injury more so than what I had just diagnosed as a broken leg. So we were evacuated really efficiently off the ground. A Chinook helicopter with the medical emergency response team, the MERT, came in. Each of us then had a paramedic. So obviously had a little bit more than morphine at that point, and we were flown back to the hospital at Camp Bastion. What I didn't know had happened was that our operations officer in my regiment had phoned ahead to the hospital where his wife was a nurse and had asked her to make sure that she met me off the ambulance, which I just thought was such a lovely little touch, that there was a friendly face there when I got in off the ground. I was 36 hours in Bastion Hospital. During that time, had some investigative surgery and an external fixation, what I believe is a Hoffman 2, was put onto my leg, so stretching from my foot all the way up to my mid-thigh, basically, you know, holding all those broken bones together. And I can remember being in hospital and wiggling my toes, and the nurse coming along and sort of, you know, pressing each of my toes and asking if I could feel it. And sometimes I could, and sometimes I couldn't. But I thought, well, you know, I can feel it sometimes, so that's got to be a good sign. And we were then flown back to the UK on a sort of an early morning flight, and it has to be the best flight I've ever taken, you know, doped up as I was to the nines, probably with lots of pain relief. And so I had a very, very comfortable ride home. When I got back to the UK, it was a Monday afternoon, and everything at Selly Oak Hospital in Birmingham just kicked in. What had struck me through all of this experience was the incredible calm, measured response, right from, you know, the combat medics on the ground in Helmand Province through to Bastion Hospital, where again there was no sort of, you know, ER dramatics of you know, hype up for the television or film. And again, back in Birmingham, everybody was just quietly going about doing their job, and it's incredibly reassuring from a patient's perspective, just to know that everybody's getting on with it. This isn't you know, chaos. It's not panic. The people that, you know, are looking after you, it's sort of all in a day's work, and that's incredibly reassuring. So I had some initial surgery again that night. I remember just being annoyed that I couldn't eat, because I hadn't eaten for about 2 or 3 days, and I was starving, and especially having been out on the ground for 3 days before that and not eating terribly well. And then on the Tuesday morning, I had a conversation with Prof. Porter. And I can remember him explaining the extent of my injury. So I'd had an MRI scan, and I believe that was to confirm the extent of them as to what options lay ahead. And so he really calmly explained that my lower leg was what he described as a jigsaw of fractures. I remember that phrase really well. It helped to paint a picture. And he said that he could try to fuse my ankle, but I'd probably be in pain on a daily basis and walk with a stick. And if you cast your mind back to the photograph of the sort of 4-year-old Kate with that, you know, fierce look of determination, that definitely wasn't the future that I'd envisaged for myself. I knew that I wanted to continue to live an active life, so this wasn't the option for me. So I asked him what the alternative was, and he said, well, we can amputate. And although your fractures extend right up into the tibial plateau, we'll try amputating first of all below the knee to save your knee. And I remember asking him whether with a prosthetic limb I'd be able to run, play tennis and ski. And he said yes. And I said, well, that's fine then. And I know it sounds a very blasé telling of what was obviously a very serious conversation, but for me it was a very straightforward decision based on function, based on wanting to continue to live that active life. Some people since have called it a courageous decision. I'd argue against that. I'd say it was a confident one. I was confident in the information that I'd been given. I was confident in my surgeon and his team, and I was confident in the rehab pathway that lay ahead. So it was a confident decision. But even though a decision can be straightforward and you can have confidence in it, it doesn't mean that there isn't a reality to it. And I'm sure I don't need to warn you about the next slide because you will all have seen far worse in your time, but it is a slightly more graphic one. And the reason I show you this is not for the gore. You know, we can all see plenty of that nowadays if we want to, but it is just to sort of remind ourselves that there is a reality to the decisions that we make. And I think something that I've taken from this is I can remember sometimes feeling like a sort of piece of meat on a sort of butcher's counter in those early days. I mean, this was literally, I think, the day that I had the amputation, so the Wednesday. And of course, there were moments where I felt a bit down and, you know, wondered how long all this was going to take. But ultimately, I just wanted to move forward, and it helped so much having other patients either still in the hospital or come back and visit, who, you know, were walking really well on their prosthetics, to give you that sense of hope that that actually if they can do it, then so can I. And, you know, really for me, it was a question of let's not wallow. You know, this situation could be so much worse. You know, I'm alive. And I'm safe back in the UK. You know, my boys are still out in Afghanistan, so I had an awful lot to be grateful for, and that sense of perspective is always something that's really helped me. And I really just wanted to work out how to get back on my foot again. So let's move on. I rehabilitated for about 16 months. That included some return visits to hospital for revision surgery, including to treat a deep bone infection that threatened, but thankfully didn't take any more of my leg. And then I returned to work. So really fortunate that because of my rank and my cap badge, and because my injury wasn't nearly as severe as many, I was able to carry on serving in the army. And I actually served for 7 years post-injury, so slightly longer after I was injured than I had done before, which just goes to show not only is, you know, the trauma care excellent, you know, from point of injury through to the hospital back in the UK, but also, you know, the rehab that I undertook at Headley Court was just absolutely phenomenal. I returned to work, and my focus was then very much on my professional career and re-establishing myself professionally. So I worked towards promotion, I earned promotion, and I was really, really pleased and really proud. But I felt that I wasn't achieving physically the level of activity that had made that decision to lose my leg relatively straightforward. So I had some further surgery to make my leg more comfortable, to help the fitting of the prosthetic be more comfortable so I could do more. And it was whilst I was recovering from that surgery that I received an email asking if I would like to apply to take part in an expedition to ski to the South Pole. And I thought, well, that sounds brilliant. That's just the sort of goal that I need to really shift my focus away from career and back onto rehab and really get myself strong and fit again. I had an interesting conversation with my surgeons who had just performed that revision surgery on me, very nervous that they might think I was about to undo all their good work, but I could not have asked for better support. They simply said to me, Kate, you have got to live the life that you want to live, and we are here to support you. So John Kendrew and Dimitri Viviades have been absolutely phenomenal, and continuing the excellent work that Prof Porter started. So I'm enormously grateful. A few months later, when I was actually out in Antarctica, I think I wish they'd taught me out of it, however. So this was an incredibly demanding challenge. It was to ski 3 degrees, which is about 335 kilometers, down to the South Pole. It was to be a race between 3 teams of injured service personnel from the UK, the US, Australia and Canada. And so as well as that goal to work towards my rehab, I also really liked the team nature of the challenge. And then the charitable focus as well. So the expedition was organised by Walking with the Wounded, which really focuses on getting ex-servicemen and women back into the world of work ultimately. And I was very conscious that I'd been lucky to be able to return to service, and an awful lot of other people hadn't. So I wanted to do what I could to help raise awareness and money for such a great cause. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this expedition now, because I think it's formed a fairly sort of fundamental part of my rehab journey. So I just share a few photos and a bit of the story with you before sort of moving on to the end. So for those of you who haven't been to Antarctica, there are various different routes in. We chose to stage in via Cape Town in South Africa, where we flew to the coast of Antarctica initially, to this Russian logistics base, which I won't try to pronounce, we just call it Novo. And after a couple of days acclimatizing there, we then flew up onto the plateau to the 87th degree. These are the conditions on the coast of Antarctica whilst we were in Cape Town, which delayed us getting in there. It was really windy. You can perhaps just see kind of to the top left of the camera, there's somebody falling over. So whilst it might sound lovely to be stranded in Cape Town for a few extra days, actually, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, you know, when you train for something and you're nervous already, you just want to get to the start line and take that first step. And actually being told to wait just sort of makes you more apprehensive. But we made it in. And after a couple of days, we boarded a Basler 1948 prop plane. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you anything else about it, which would take us up onto the plateau. I remember we were welcomed on board by our Canadian pilot called Chuck. And he decided to tell us a couple of bits of information about this aircraft. He said, oh, 2 years ago, actually, this aircraft crashed. We thought, okay, we really don't want to hear this anecdote, thank you. It's not terribly helpful. But what he felt it necessary to add also was that he'd been the pilot on that day too. So few seatbelts frantically trying to get undone at that point. But needless to say, obviously, we made it up safely. So many challenges from an expedition like this, and I'm sure many, if not most of them, won't come as a surprise, but I'll just take you through a few of them. So of course the cold was a challenge. It's the coldest place on Earth. Our average daily temperature was minus 35 degrees, and our coldest day with wind chill was minus 45. So you can do lots of training for that. You can make sure you've got the right clothing and the right equipment, the right expertise in terms of your polar guides, and the doctor that we had with us who specialised in cold environments, and you can train in similar places, but ultimately you've got to perhaps be prepared to be a bit uncomfortable. And I'm only going to embarrass myself by sharing a couple of photos of some mild frostbite that I got. Thankfully didn't lose any more bits of my body, and a few of us did suffer some mild bits of frostbite. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, sometimes, as I say, discomfort has to be put up with. The terrain was something that came as a bit of a surprise. So in a lot of photographs you'll see of Antarctica, it looks completely flat, and actually it's far from it. In the winters, so we were there in sort of late spring, summer, but in the winters, what are called katabatic winds whip across the plateau. And of course, there's nothing there, no features to stop them. So they build in energy very, very quickly and whip up the snow into what are called sastrugi, so these big ridges. And these extend to about sort of 4 feet high in places. And what we couldn't have known was that the previous winter had been particularly harsh. And so these sastrugi were higher and extended further south, so closer into, into the terrain that we would be skiing over than would normally be the case. Now, the impact that had was that whereas we had trained to be able to ski 35 kilometres a day and had planned, our arrival at the pole on that basis, actually the more demanding terrain meant that we could only cover about 25 kilometres a day. So you have to, adapt your plan, which is not easy in such a hostile environment. The altitude was something that we knew about, but really couldn't do much to mitigate against. Everybody suffered to some degree, whether that was headaches or, classic headaches and sickness. But this is a more interesting incident, that weighted word, interesting. So here we have Dr. Dan on the left. explaining to Eric what has happened to his lungs. So Eric collapsed on about day 2 with a pulmonary edema, and you all know much more about that than I do, but of course potentially fatal. Thankfully he recovered, and actually recovered very quickly. But what's interesting about this is that Eric was one of the polar guides, and actually of the 3 polar guides that we had, 1 for each team, he had the most Antarctic experience. So it goes to show what a hostile environment, you know, we were working in. And, you know, you have to think about what you do when the leader of your team goes man down and is taken out of the picture, you know, so making sure you've got that redundancy to be able to keep going. Now, you might have expected me to talk about the team's injuries up front. So every of the 4 injured in each team, every member of the British team had suffered some limb loss. Through the other members of the teams, there were burns injuries, spinal, PTSD, nervous system damage. So a real range of really challenging injuries. But I would argue actually that they were not our biggest challenge, because that was all positive information that we had up front that we could mitigate for with our clothing, with our equipment, with our training. But one chap who does stand out as unique in this respect is the chap you can see on the screen now, so Ivan. And you can see that he has poles attached to his hips, connecting him to the pulk in front. And that's so that he can navigate the terrain, because Ivan's completely blind. So if you imagine doing all that I've described, but effectively doing it with your eyes closed, you can understand how immensely more difficult it was for Ivan, and why he was falling over probably kind of 30 plus times a day. And if you've been skiing and you've fallen over, you know that once is enough. Actually, it gets pretty debilitating psychologically very quickly. So a real inspiration, this guy, on many levels. All those trials and tribulations aside, we did make it to the South Pole on Friday, the 13th of December. So a lucky day for us. And relief, I think, was the biggest feeling across the team. But obviously we did make time to pop some champagne later on. And